February 2016, Mum gave me a phone call and said, Andrew, I've got to go to get a test done, a colonoscopy done. It's a standard thing, but the doc said I need someone to bring me because I can't drive home. Would you mind, giving me a lift? So I picked up Mum from her home and took her to the hospital where she had a colonoscopy. And after the colonoscopy, the doctor came out and said, Andrew, your mother's not going to be going home. I suspect she probably has about 7 weeks. And there's just nothing we can do. And so they were incredibly kind. It was a private hospital and they shifted her to a room upstairs and they said, we're going to let her stay here for those 7 weeks. They found an end room at the end of a hallway. And for the next 7 weeks, I got to be with Mum every day. I had complete release from my eldership to be present. Every day I got to drive in, pick up a Portuguese tart at the cafe, because Mum loved Portuguese tarts. I'd get the iPad out and we would play Scrabble and we would talk. And I'd ask questions about her childhood, questions that I'd never thought about asking. The places where she used to play as a kid, the books she read. I don't know, as I think about this topic about drawing close to those around us, those 7 weeks of deep grief, but deep joy, I guess is one of the times when I think I felt closest to someone else, and it was my own mum. And fortunately, she was in no pain, and for 6 of those 7 weeks, she was completely lucid. The last week, she slept most of the time, and then she passed maybe at 7.5 weeks, and my brother and I were with her when she passed, when she took her last breath. And it was a gift. During that time, one of my best friends, Steve, would drop over after I'd go through the day, and my brother had his own business and he couldn't get out through the day, so about 4 o'clock we would cross paths. He'd come in at the hospital and I'd leave, and he'd stay through till late evening, and that's how we did those 7 weeks. But when I got home about 5 o'clock each afternoon, most afternoons, Steve would just drop in. And we'd sit on the front porch, we'd have a Guinness, and we'd just talk about the weather. I'd ask him about his day, and I don't know, it was just this incredible period of also experience someone coming close to me. Steve just loved me. He just was a friend who knew he didn't need to try and fix things. He didn't need to come up with any deep answers. He just sat with me for about an hour, then he'd go home. There's a real gift in experiencing really turning up for people and really being present with people and experiencing the closeness that can come from time that is so clearly focused with intention. Coming alive to those closest to us is our topic this morning. And yesterday we explored coming alive to divine friendship, coming alive to beloved community, coming alive coming alive to who we are with Gary. And this morning, coming alive to those closest to us. How can we come alive to those closest to us? That's really the question that I'm exploring this morning. And I know that this morning is going to be a bit of a fire hose. There's going to be a whole lot of things that I'm going to throw out there. And my prayer is that there may just be one thing that will stick for you. One idea, one concept, one thought that the Holy Spirit might just plant into your life that will just lead you on a journey towards exploring how you might experience closeness with others. First up, coming alive to those around us. We come alive to those around us by being fully present to others. There's nothing like being in a conversation with someone when they're looking right over your shoulder. Remember those experiences when you're talking with someone and you're really wondering if they're even there? They're just not even looking at you in the eye, they're just looking over, they're looking around, and nothing quite as disconcerting as that. Doesn't really make you feel valued, does it? But when you meet someone who is truly present with you, truly there for you, it's something else. When, just a little of my story, I guess, when I went to seminary at the end of that time, that year, my wife Carol and I got married. I was 25, she was 22, and our denomination offered church planting grants. They had 3 church planting grants, where they paid your wage full-time for the first year, then went down by 20% every year for 5 years. And so I thought, give it a crack, have a go. How hard could it be? I guess at 25 you sort of think you can give anything a go. I thought, I could at least blow the money and then do something else. And so my wife and I went up about an hour north of Sydney and planted the Coast Community Church. And what was amazing was when I didn't grow up in a Christian home. When I was 13, I was invited to a youth group because there were girls there. Why else would you go as a 13-year-old non-Christian lad? And through that youth group, I ended up coming to know Christ. And I went to the church service, the evening service, and there was this white-haired old guy as an interim pastor that year. And the following year, it was a new pastor came in. When I went to seminary, I went to a class on spiritual formation, actually, and the book we were studying was Celebration of Discipline. And this same white-haired old bloke turned up, and he looked at me, and he said, "Andrew Ranucci." It was like 10 years later. I was like a 13-year-old kid. I didn't even know he knew me. But he saw me. When I went up to the Central Coast to plant Coast Community Church, guess who came for the first Sunday? And this guy's name, would you believe, is James Henderson. His name is Jim Henderson. It's the same name as James, but his name's Jim. That's why I've always loved you, Jim. And so he had retired and moved to the Central Coast, and he said, "Andrew, would you mind if I could be part of your church?" And he became, the first member. He became someone who just every Sunday was there and supporting. And he always just saw me. A few years later, it was time for just to give you an example of the way that I just felt him being so present to me. A few years later, I had to do my first funeral. An older member started attending, and she just passed away suddenly. And I'd never done a funeral before. I figured they should have taught me that in seminary, but I'm not sure, maybe I wagged that class, I don't know. So I just, rang Jim and said, Jim, can you give me some pointers here? So he goes, come around, Andrew, we'll work on it together. And so I went down to his place and we worked on a funeral service together and showed me what to do, how to put it together. He just was so gracious and so kind and so gentle in the way that he just led me through. So we got to the point where I had everything done. The funeral was coming up. I knew the funeral parlour was the crematorium was about 45 minutes away, so I thought I'll give it an hour. So I left an hour before the funeral, and I thought I'll go the back way because it's quieter. I won't get stuck in traffic. So I go the back way, and there's roadworks. This is like before my mobile phones, right? So I was just stuck in roadworks, and I'm watching the clock tick and tick, and I'm like, I'm not going to make it. My first funeral, and I'm not going to make it. And it's like, you have like a 30-minute time slot for a funeral in those crematoriums, right? And then they move you out, and I'm starting to sweat. And eventually, I get there like a quarter of an hour late. So it was like 2 p.m. and I get there like 2:15. And I'm running to the door, glass doors, and I look through, and there's Jim on the stage, leading the service. I walk in, and he as soon as I walked in, he said, "Would everyone please bow their heads so we can pray?" And he looked up at me, and there wasn't a wrinkle of judgment in his face. Not a wrinkle. He just went like that. And as he prayed, I walked up. He slipped away. I led the service, and he never said a thing. Never said a thing. At the end of the service, he just said, "Good job, Andrew." That's how I've experienced someone being fully present to me. Just fully present. He saw me. He supported me. He loved me. How can we be fully present to others? What can it look like for us to be a Jim Henderson to others? To see people. To love people well. We see Jesus doing this, don't we? With Zacchaeus. He saw Zacchaeus. He saw him. "Come down. I must stay at your house today." So he welcomed him gladly. I love how Jesus just saw people. He noticed people. There wasn't a wrinkle of judgment in his eyes. So what does it look like for us to come alive to those around us? I think it takes at least 3 things: presence, focus, and sacrifice. It means to be fully present and aware of someone before us. It means to be giving them our complete focus and our complete attention. But it also takes a sacrifice, because in that moment you're sacrificing every other opportunity. You're sacrificing the opportunity to answer that notification on your phone, or that person that's walking in the background. You're actually focused and giving your attention to the person before you. Coming alive to those around us by being fully present. Secondly, we can come alive to those around us by engaging in curiosity. As a kid, I was always a curious kid. I don't know, I just always had a million questions for everyone. You know, parents would have people over for dinner and I'd just be asking questions. What sort of watch is that? You know, how much was it? I just have a billion questions. And I remember often adults say to me, Andrew, why do you ask so many questions? I was just curious. But that curiosity just ended up, I think, shaping in some ways my pastoral ministry. Because I was just really curious about people. And so when new people would visit the church, I just asked them a million questions. And I was always curious about where they lived. So I was one of those, maybe these days it's an old-fashioned pastor, I don't know, but I was just one of those guys, I was in everyone's homes. Like, if someone visited the church, within 2 weeks I'd be in their home. I was just curious, that's all. I was just curious. Wonder where they live. What sort of car they drive. Wonder if their home is messy or tidy. You know, I wonder who lives in their home. Does a grandmother live in the back shed or... Like, I was just curious. I'd just turn up and I'd get to know them and I was curious about their lives and what they did for work and what their kids' names were, and I was just curious. I just really enjoyed getting to know people. And I just found that if I got into their home and just saw their context, for some reason their names would stick better, at least. That curiosity, I think, helped me to come close to others, helped me to experience a greater level of I guess, intimacy of relationship. I know that's not everyone's way, but it's certainly a way that's, I guess, it's helped and guided me into this practice of coming close to others. As we see, Jesus was curious, wasn't he? I love how James mentioned yesterday that Jesus asked 307 questions and he was only asked 183 questions. So Jesus was curious. He asked a lot of questions. How could we nurture our curiosity as a way of stewarding this capacity to draw close to others and come alive to others? Thirdly, I think we can come alive to those around us by receiving or giving and receiving forgiveness. We started in a little building up on the coast and we ended up buying this little building pretty cheaply. It probably only sat 60 people, but it was enough to get us started. And after a few years, we were outgrowing the building and there was nowhere for the kids. I mean, we bought like a caravan, like a trailer that we used to run kids programs out of. Anyway, after a few years, it just became a bit impossible. So as an eldership, we decided that, I had 4 elders. Jim was one of them. He was the chairman. We decided that, we all agreed, a unanimous decision, that we would leave the building. We would move about 7 minutes away, so it wasn't that far, to an elementary school where they had a hall that would sit 100, maybe 120, 150, where we could continue to grow, and a lot of room for the kids to have classes for Sunday school. And so we made that decision and we said, okay, this date we're going to be meeting at Empire Bay Public School, and everyone in the congregation, seemed happy. A couple of people were like, oh, it's a shame that we're leaving our building, and I get that. But we wanted to keep the big vision before us, and so we made the move. As I said, we had about 60 in the church, and when we had our first Sunday service at Empire Bay Public School, I got up to sort of welcome people, and instead of 60, we had 40. I'm thinking, There's about 20 people missing here. What's going on? Well, that Sunday, one of my elders decided that there were a few people that weren't happy about the decision, that he would open the old building up and run a service there. So 20 people were meeting in the old building. And Merv, I guess, completely betrayed me and the elders. It was pretty painful. And so we met with him, and he was adamant that this is what God wanted him to do, and he was being faithful to these people who weren't happy about the move, and so they continued on. And to this day there's still a church meeting there with about 20 people, different people these days, but still bumbling along. And we ended up giving them the building, all our assets. 5 years later, his wife brings me up and says, "Andrew, would you mind coming to visit Merv?" And I don't know about you, but I just started to almost internally shake. I was like, I just had so much pain. And I was young, so I guess I felt that pain more sharply, maybe. And I said, yes, sure. And then she said, Merv's been diagnosed with motor neurones disease. I think here it's called Lou Gehrig's disease. Yeah. And I said, okay. And so I went and visited Merv. And I ended up visiting him for the next 18 months, most Thursday afternoons. We made our peace. And then I did his funeral. It's amazing how we can draw close to others through forgiveness. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." I just imagine just the feeling that Peter must have had when Jesus just reached out to him with forgiveness, reinstating him. The closeness that came between the two of them. Have you experienced the closeness and the gift of coming close to those around you through the offering and the receiving of forgiveness? How might God be inviting us to experience more of that? I came across a benediction that Shauna Nyquist, you may know her as Bill Hybels' daughter, wrote, and I just thought it was beautiful. It was a Sunday at Willow Creek where they were discussing forgiveness. I'd just like to read it out to you. May we become a tribe of forgiveness. People who give grace, who give second chances, who give freedom and live in that same freedom. May the path of forgiveness become well-worn and familiar, like a road we've walked all our lives, that we walk over and over and over. May the muscle memory of grace giving become as natural as breathing. Something we long to do, not something we dread. Something that feels like exhaling, like dropping something heavy, like laying down something that's been breaking our back. May our family relationships, our work relationships, relationships with our neighbours and with our children be unencumbered by the past, so that we can live wholly in the present, aware of God's goodness, our lives shaped by the rhythm of forgiveness, grace and freedom. Amen. That's pretty cool, isn't it? I think she's on to something about how we come alive to those around us and to those closest to us through the offering and the gift of forgiveness. Well, in keeping with my 7-ness, we also come alive to those around us by celebrating. By celebrating. And James tells me that Mexicans know how to celebrate. Is that right, James? They know how to celebrate?
They do.
I guess I love parties. I love getting together with people. I guess you've experienced a little of that the last couple of nights. But it'll be bigger tonight. You just wait. Fortunately, my wife, she's a 2 and she's an incredible, she has an incredible gift of hospitality. And it's not uncommon for us to have parties of 40 people at our home. And I know Trevor and Gary and Regina have experienced that in our home. And Carol just making these pots of pasta about this big, and like it's just an ease for her. It's just not even, doesn't think twice about cooking for 40 people. It sort of works well for me. No, we love doing that together. And I guess celebration is the beautiful way, isn't it, of being able to come close to those around us. We come close to those around us, through the grace of being present and through experiencing the gift of forgiveness, but it's also through celebration, celebrating one another. And yes, it can come in special ways, like big parties. And Henry Nouwen writes, celebration is not only a part of special occasions, but an ongoing awareness that every moment is special and asked to be lifted up and recognised as a blessing from on high. And it doesn't need to be a big party. How do we celebrate others in a note, in a card, in an email, in an invitation for lunch, in a few words spoken meaningfully, as we celebrate what we see in others, as we give that offering of encouragement to another? How can we draw close to others in our world? Through celebration, through celebrating them, celebrating God together. I love the picture that Jesus gives us of the way that heaven celebrates. I'll tell you that in the same way there'll be more rejoicing in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who do not need to repent. I just love that image of celebration. And obviously in Luke 15, that beautiful image. But the father said to the servants, "Quick, bring the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his finger, sandals on his feet, bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For the son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found." Dallas Willard writes, "We engage with celebration when we enjoy ourselves, our life, our world, in conjunction with our faith and confidence in God's greatness, beauty and goodness. We concentrate on our life and world as God's work and as God's gift to us." So how can we steward celebration as a way of also coming close to others? Secondly, we come alive to those closest to us by allowing God's love to pour through us and into others. And as I said, at the start, when Mum was diagnosed with cancer, I experienced, my elders, 7 years ago, just expressing such compassion. When they came to me and said, Andrew, we can look after the church, the ministry team are fine, you just take as much time as you need. And they just gave me this complete release to be fully present with Mum for those. That's just a gift. And it was a gift of compassion. When you receive compassion like that, I don't know, it just helps you experience the compassion of Christ. And it certainly, was an example of how God's love is poured through us to others. How do people experience God's love being poured through us to others? How do people experience that through us? I've led a few retreats with a friend from San Francisco. His name's Mark Scandrett. I know a couple of people here in the room know him. Mark has a practice that he does. He's done it a few times when I've been with him. And it's a practice called Eyes of Compassion. It's a wonderful practice. And he gets us all to go to the busiest part of the town that we're in, wherever we are. And he invites us just to walk around the town for an hour, looking at people, and whenever we see anyone, we just say, in our mind, we say, you are a blessed child of God. You're a blessed child of God. After the 48th time, you feel like a parrot, but you just keep going, And what's interesting? After doing that for an hour, all of a sudden you start to have compassion for the mum struggling with 3 kids, for the businessman who's running across the road from the bank, the folder under his arm, hoping for some big deal that'll make him millions. For the homeless person who's just saying, you're a blessed child of God. And it's a beautiful way of actually experiencing in 1 hour growing eyes of compassion. And I offer, if that's something that you'd like to explore, why not give that a go in your town? Go for a walk for an hour in the busiest part of town, and every time you see someone, just say, you're a blessed child of God. It's amazing. I've experienced it a few times, and it's certainly been a gift. We see this in Jesus, don't we? His eyes of compassion. Jesus straightened up and asked the woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir. Then neither do I condemn you. Go now, leave your life of sin. Jesus just had eyes of compassion. And I think it's helped him draw close to others. Secondly, through words of encouragement. As we know, psychologists say we need to hear 10 positives for every negative. So we need to hear lots of encouraging statements if we're going to offset all the negative ones that are spoken. And certainly Scripture encourages us to encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact we are doing. Words are incredibly life-giving. And those words that the Father said to the Son, this is my Son whom I love, with him I am well pleased. I imagine those words just kept ringing out in Jesus' mind and heart. Such formative words, I imagine, hearing those words from your Father. This is my Son whom I love, with him I am well pleased. Now, what are the most formative words that you've heard spoken to you? Just think about your life. What are some of the most formative words that have been spoken to you?
I'm proud of you.
Wow. Yeah, wow. I remember at the end of my first year of seminary, I wanted to stretch my legs and do something because I used to do a fair bit of cycling as a teenager, and I decided I wanted to do a cycle around Tasmania. It's the little island off the bottom of Australia, and so I decided I'd need 3 weeks to do this cycle tour around Tasmania. But what it meant was that I needed to miss a mandatory event at seminary, which was the end of year graduation. All students had to be at this end of year graduation. And that was in what would have been my first week in Tasmania. And worse than that, that week I also had like a Greek exam. And so I got alongside the Greek lecturer and managed to arrange to do my exam early the week before, which he kindly allowed me to do sort of, in a way that wasn't quite official, but he was kind. And anyway, so I took off and did my cycle tour. It was the end of that year. I came back the first week of year 2 of seminary, and I get a note in my pigeonhole, could you come and see the principal? And I'm like, oh no. And I remember being called in to Keith Farmer, who was, in fact, I think Trevor's met Keith, my principal, and I said, I remember him saying, Andrew, it sounds like the end of last year was eventful. And I said, yeah. And he goes, you understand the graduation was mandatory, and I noticed you weren't there. And I also noticed that you'd secretly arranged to do your Greek exam at a different time. It's quite manipulative. I'm like, I actually started crying. I was that full of shame. And his next words have stuck with me forever. As you have shown, what was the word? I'm too nervous to think of it. You have shown great initiative, and that will serve you well in ministry. He knew I was sorry, but you've shown great initiative. This will serve you well in ministry. Probably 15 years later, he and his wife retired to the Central Coast, and guess which church they came to? They ended up being a congregation member. But just, those, I mean, he could have said other words that would have shaped me, right? The words that we speak into the lives of others can shape them. How are our words shaping those around us? How can we choose words of life rather than death? Words that bring life. Yeah. Allowing God's love to pour through us into others through words of encouragement, but also through acts of kindness. As I said, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. When I told my parents that I was, they were divorced by that stage, but I told Mum was always just very supportive in whatever I did. She was incredible. But I remember my dad being quite disappointed that I was going to go to seminary and not study business and follow his sort of career. And about 15 years ago now, my dad's second wife, her sister was in hospital dying of cancer, and she was a Buddhist. And Dad calls me and says, Andrew, Stella wants you to come and visit her. And I said, sure, but I thought she was a Buddhist. And she said, well, she called in a Buddhist priest and all he wanted was money, and she figured she's not a Buddhist anymore, so she wants you to come and see her. And I'm like, okay. And so I went and visited her and anyway, shared the gospel, and she ended up becoming a Christian in her deathbed, you know. And there was a chaplain who was also in the hospital. He was an Anglican guy, and he was a beautiful man. And in the end, once she passed, because the hospital was near his church and where they all lived, we ended up doing the funeral at his church. And this was a little Anglican church, probably 30 people. And this little Anglican church, those 30 people who didn't know my dad and his wife, bar so, put on this incredible wake. Typical church, like great little church, with so kind. And Dad was like at the funeral, he goes, why are they all doing this? Why are they coming out with food? Why are they? And they were just blown away by the kindness of this little church. And for years I've been saying to Dad, you should do the Alpha course. It's an Introduction to Christianity course. And he'd always laugh it off. And anyway, they were so moved by the kindness of this church that they sort of felt obliged to go and visit the following Sunday, because they thought, well, we've got to at least thank them. And I'm like, okay. And so anyway, they went and visited the church the following Sunday, 30 people. And that Sunday, the pastor gets up and says, we're going to run the Alpha course, starting in 3 weeks. And he came straight up to my dad and said, would you guys like to register for the Alpha course? And they were like, felt obliged, because the church had done so much for them in this funeral. So they were like, okay. And then Dad rang me and said, oh, you won't believe what just happened. And he told me the story. And the following Sunday, they go back to the church because, again, they sort of felt obliged. And he rings me up and says, the good news, Andrew, is that no one else is registered at this stage, so it's only us. So I think it won't happen, And the following week, rings me up again. We went back again, and it looks. I just wanted to make sure that no one else was going to register, And he goes, no one else is registered, so it sounds like I've dodged a bullet. Anyway, the following week he goes back, and the pastor comes up to him and says, unfortunately, no one else is registered. And Dad was like, phew. But I've decided I'm going to run it just for you two. And so he ran the course just for them too. And by the end of it, they came to Christ. It was incredible. Acts of kindness. Coming alive to those around us through acts of kindness. How are our acts of kindness drawing others to experience the love of God? When Jesus came down from the mountainside, large crowds followed him. A man with leprosy came and knelt before him and said, Lord, if you're willing, you can make me clean. Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. I am willing, he said, be clean. Immediately the leprosy, he was cleansed from leprosy. Jesus touching the untouchable. So kind. He was a channel of God's love. And finally, viewing the family as a laboratory for loving relationships. Coming alive to those closest to us means also coming alive to those, in our family. So how can our family be a lab for loving relationships? Well, by sharing life-giving spiritual practices as a family is certainly one way. And I guess not coming from a Christian home, I really didn't have much of a history with what this would look like. I was in some ways running blind with how to raise kids in a Christian home and what that looked like. I guess one thing I knew I didn't want anything that we did to feel like duty, feel like it was something that we needed to do, but it would be something that we wanted to do. There was an element of delight in what we did as a family when it came to spiritual practices. I think the practices, I think back, I mean, our girls are older now, 25, 23 and 18, but when they were younger, one of the things that we decided that we would do is set aside the Saturdays as a Sabbath. And I guess this was fairly unique in our culture, because Australia, probably like America, is a very sporting nation, and so Saturdays is often filled with parents driving kids from one sporting match to another. And we knew what, if we engaged with sport in that way, we knew what our weekend would look like, given that Sundays was filled with church. And so we just made the decision that our girls would do any sport they wanted through the week. Through the week, the evenings, the afternoons, we would do whatever sport they wanted. But from Friday evening through to Saturday evening, we would just engage with a Sabbath time, where we would just enjoy being a family. We wouldn't have anything we had to do. A lot of things we wanted to do and that we did do, and we had a lot of recreation, times down at the beach, picnics, drives. We just enjoyed a lot of family time on Saturdays. They were unrushed, that were filled with a sense of God's presence, and allowed us to experience being a loving family. And I think looking back, and even the girls now would say that was probably one of the most formative practices, just in enjoying Sabbath together as a family. And I think they recognised that because they saw, I guess, the difference in some of their friends. Now, as we know, Jesus said that, Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And Adele writes, Jesus took specific aim at the misunderstanding of the Sabbath. As Lord of the Sabbath, he freely interpreted the Sabbath command, claiming that God gave it to people as a restorative and recuperative gift. And how can it be a restorative and recuperative gift for our families? God did not intend for life to be full of effort, so he punctuated each week with 24 hours of Sabbath rest, during which people could remember what life is about and who it is for. And I think if our Sabbath can help us become an even greater loving family to one another, and it helps us to realise what a Sabbath is for. How might a Sabbath be celebrated by your family as a way of experiencing the presence and the love of God? Including children in ministries, opportunities for ministry. I think this is another way that we can experience the family unit as being a lab for loving relationships. I love the difference between the word amateur and the word professional. Sometimes as ministers, as pastors, we can be professional. Our kids know that we're on because we have to be on. Sunday mornings we're on the stage, and that's our job. It's how we put bread on the table. But there's a big difference between an amateur and a professional. The word amateur comes from the Latin word amare, which means to love. In Italian, I've got Italian heritage, and if I say I love you, it's ti amo. And so, how do you say it in Spanish? What's Spanish for that? Ti amo? There you go, ti amo. Same. Told you I speak Spanish, James. And so, an amateur does something simply because they love it. They simply do it because they love it, not because they want to earn money from it. And so I think it's important for our children to see us as amateurs and not just as professionals. How can our children see us as amateurs? Because we minister because we just love to minister. We spend time with God because we love God, not because we're just having to write a sermon. How can we lean more into being an amateur rather than a professional? And so some of the ways that I guess I chose to do that with the girls was on a Thursday night I'd go and just serve at a soup kitchen with one of the girls in the local area where we just go and cook and serve. It's just something that we would do just with me and one of my daughters, just two of us. Taking them on a mission trip where we just get to do it together as amateurs and not professionals. What are ways that you can share ministry with your children as amateurs? How could you explore doing things with them in ministry simply for the love of it? Not because you have to do it, not because your name's on a roster, but simply because of your love for God and others. And I guess that ties in with we're just noticing our children's spiritual gifts too and helping to encourage them. Lastly, making great memories as a family, I think, is a great way that we can view the family as a lab for loving relationships. I love this passage in Psalm 105. Give praise to the Lord, proclaim his name. Make known among the nations what he has done. Sing to him, sing songs of praise to him. Tell of all his wonderful acts. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Look to the Lord in his strength. Seek his face always. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles and the judgments he pronounced. You, his servants, the descendants of Abraham, his chosen ones, the children of Jacob. Tell of all his wonderful acts. Remember the wonders he has done. God knows that looking back is really important. And I think that principle also works when it comes to our families. To be able to look back and tell of just the wonderful things and wonderful experiences that you've enjoyed as a family unit. And experiencing just the grace of God and the goodness of God and the gifts of God. And so doing things that will help us to create treasured memories as a family together, I think for me has been a way that I've sought to steward the family and to steward the family as a lab for loving relationships. In Australia, we have something called long service leave. It's mandatory in Australia. All companies, if you're an employee of any company, even a part-time employee, every company in Australia has to set aside 1 week's wage every year in a fund called a long service leave fund. It's almost like an automatic sabbatical for every worker in Australia. It doesn't matter if you're a postal worker, a nurse, teacher, a cleaner. Everyone gets long service leave. And so at the end of 10 years, you get 10 weeks in addition to your standard 4 or 5 weeks annual vacation, which is standard in Australia. So when it comes to 10 years, you get automatically 3 months paid leave. Not a bad system. Not a bad system. Come. I'm making Australia look really attractive, aren't I? Until you meet the snakes. And so at the end of 10 years, I'd been going pretty hard for 10 years, and I always had this dream of, I guess being a 7, I'm going to have high expectations of fun. And so I had this dream of, and it's a bit of an Australian thing, it's called to do the lap. And doing the lap means that you basically drive around Australia. Some people call it going around the block. And so I asked my eldership, I said, look, instead of 3 months, do you mind if I take it at half time, at half pay, and go for 6 months? And I had a team by then, and so it was completely manageable, and they were incredibly gracious, and so they allowed us to go for 6 months. And so I bought a trailer and packed the girls in the back seat. And I remember as we left, Ruby, our elder, said, Dad, have you got a map? I said, oh yeah, I've got some maps. Because how are you going to know how to drive around Australia? Good question from like a 8-year-old or something. And I said, well, sweetheart, I think if we just keep the ocean to the right, then we'll end up in the same place. We just keep the ocean to the right and keep driving the same direction, we should end up in the same place. And that satisfied her. And so for 6 months, we just drove around Australia and camped on beaches and camped in the outback and just experienced this incredible time of memory making. And in fact, the girls still talk about it to this day. When we're all together, something will still come up from that trip. Just making memories. I know it's a gift and it's not always possible for everyone. I get that. It's just an example from my own life as a way that we were able to create some memories. But we can also create memories in very small ways. And those date nights that you have with your child. It can be simple, and it can be cheap, and it can be accessible. What are those ways that you can create loving moments of memory making so that your kids can look back and experience the warmth of having parents that intentionally set aside time and space to experience your presence, experience being seen and being loved. So that's it. I'm going to offer you some time now to think about some questions. Some questions that I guess in some ways summarise all that I've been sharing this morning about what it might look like for us to come alive to those closest to us. And I'd like to give you a few moments just to consider these questions. What are some of the most life-giving words you've received from another? What are some of the most life-giving words that you've received from another? How have you most experienced others being fully alive? How have you most experienced being alive to others? What's one thing that could help you grow in being alive to others? And finally, what is one way your family could become a laboratory for loving relationships? Rather than just finish this and just walk out, I'd like to just settle some of this thinking for you so that you're able to actually integrate it into your own life. And just to give you 10 minutes, just to think about those questions, just to make some dot points about it. And then I would encourage you to share with one other person for the next 10 minutes. And then pray for one another in the remaining time. What time are we finishing, Gary? 10:30. So we have almost 10 minutes for just writing out some thoughts around those questions. 10 minutes in sharing with each other, and then praying for each other after that. Is that all right? I'll give you a prompt when it's time to start sharing. Okay. So just have a think about some of these questions.